Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly through palace corridors where the walls sweat with secrets and the air still hums with rivalry you can almost taste. You're standing barefoot on cold stone floors, candles flickering like nervous witnesses, while royal sisters smile at each other with mouths full of knives. This is the kind of history that looks elegant from a distance, but gets real ugly once you lean in close, and you probably won't survive this emotionally. But that's kind of the point, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop your location and local time in the comments, because somewhere in the world it's already very late, and you're choosing palace drama over sleep. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin with sisters because royal rivalry doesn't always start with strangers, it starts in the nursery. You imagine two girls raised side by side, swaddled in silk, taught the same prayers, curtsies, and dangerous lessons about obedience. One of them is told quietly that she will rule. The other is told even more quietly that she won't. Historians still argue whether rivalry is born or trained, but in royal families, comparison is the first language you learn. You feel it early, the way one sister is praised for her calm, while the other is praised for her beauty, the way one is groomed for authority, while the other is warned not to outshine her. A mainstream historical fact settles in here. In many European monarchies, daughters were raised not only as family, but as political assets, their value measured in marriage treaties and alliances. You can picture sisters at the Tudor court, or among the Habsburgs, knowing that one advantageous match could tilt the balance of power across continents. That knowledge didn't bring closeness, it brought calculation. You watch sisters smile at banquets while silently tallying who sits closer to the king, whose dowry was larger, whose future looks safer. And yes, even back then, seating arrangements mattered more than your group chat read receipts. You step closer to one particularly famous dynamic: sisters competing for inheritance, favor, or survival. Sometimes the rivalry was subtle: who received better tutors, who was allowed political opinions, who was married off quickly to remove her from court. Other times it was brutal. There are fringe accounts, quirky, half-whispered through letters and memoirs, suggesting that sisters occasionally sabotaged each other's marriages with rumors or selective forgetting of correspondence. No poison rings here, but plenty of slow social suffocation. Historians still argue whether these acts were deliberate cruelty or desperate self-preservation, which honestly feels like a very thin line. You notice how gender expectations sharpened the rivalry. A royal brother could rebel and be forgiven. A sister who stepped out of line was dangerous. So sisters learned to weaponize what they were allowed: charm, obedience, fragility. One sister becomes the sweet one, the other the serious one, labels that stick like wax seals you can't peel off. And once the court decides who you are, your own sister might be the loudest voice reinforcing it, because her survival depends on you staying in your box. There's a strange intimacy to this rivalry that you can almost feel pressing against your chest. You shared toys, prayers, maybe even a bed during cold winters. You know each other's fears. That knowledge becomes leverage. You imagine a sister casually mentioning another's temper to the wrong advisor, or hinting at disloyal thoughts during confession. Nothing provable, nothing clean, but enough to tilt perception. And perception in royal courts is reality. Think less reality TV reunion, more lifelong chess match with crowns. A quirky tidbit drifts in here. In some courts, sisters were deliberately dressed alike well into adolescence to emphasize unity, even as their roles diverged sharply. On the surface, it looked charming, Underneath, it blurred identity and intensified comparison. Who wore it better? Who stood straighter? Who caught the ambassador's eye? You can almost hear the internal screaming under layers of brocade, matching outfits, cute for toddlers, psychological warfare for future queens. You start to sense how rivalry didn't always mean hatred. Sometimes it was colder than that. It was resignation. You watch one sister accept that she will always be second, while quietly resenting the other for breathing in a world tilted toward her. Historians still argue whether love and rivalry can coexist without poisoning each other, but royal letters suggest they often did. Affection threaded with bitterness, loyalty tangled with envy. It's like loving someone who got the promotion you trained for together, except the promotion comes with absolute power and the threat of exile. And let's pause for a gentle joke before this gets too heavy. Imagine family dinners where one sister is literally the future sovereign. Talk about awkward Thanksgiving energy. Pass the salt, Your Majesty? Yeah. No wonder tension simmered. You also notice how these rivalries shaped politics far beyond the family. A favoured sister might influence her ruling siblings' decisions, nudging policy, appointments, even wars. The sidelined sister, meanwhile, might align herself with opposition factions, foreign courts, or religious movements, not because she wanted chaos, but because relevance was survival. You realize that what looks like personal jealousy often had massive consequences: alliances broken, treaties delayed, rebellions quietly encouraged. There's an open scholarly debate that hangs in the air. Historians still argue whether sibling rivalry among royal women had more impact than male succession disputes, largely because women operated through informal power networks rather than official titles. You feel that truth in the shadows: power exercised through proximity, access, and emotional influence. It's softer, harder to document, and incredibly effective. Like passive-aggressive notes, but with kingdoms on the line. As you move through these early rivalries, you sense the pattern forming. This isn't an isolated story, it's the blueprint. Sisters competing for thrones, mothers' approval, survival, and legacy. You tuck this away because later you'll recognize the same dynamics between queens and cousins, mistresses and wives, mothers and daughters-in-law. The palace just keeps remixing the same tension with different dresses. You take one last look back at the nursery, at two girls kneeling side by side in prayer, already aware, somewhere deep down, that only one of them can safely shine. The candlelight flickers. One flame burns a little brighter, and the other learns how to watch, wait, and remember. You keep walking without ceremony because palace rivalries never announce themselves. They just sort of appear, like that one relative who drops by and somehow controls the entire house. You step into a space where the air is thicker, heavier with perfume and authority, and you realize you're no longer dealing with sisters raised together, but with something far more unbalanced: queens versus mothers-in-law. And yes, if you've ever felt tension with a partner's parent, congratulations. You're emotionally qualified for medieval geopolitics. You see the older woman first. She's been here longer. Her body already knows the rhythm of court life, the timing of councils, the weaknesses of servants, the way a raised eyebrow can freeze a room. She once held the same position the younger woman now occupies, or she was denied it and learned to compensate. Either way, she understands power not as a title, but as habit. Historians still argue whether dowager queens wielded more influence than reigning queens, but standing here, you can feel how experience settles into dominance like muscle memory. Then comes the younger queen. She's been imported, polished, paraded, and crowned. A mainstream historical fact anchors you. In many monarchies, new queens were expected to produce heirs quickly while remaining politically invisible. You can almost hear the contradiction snapping shut around her. She's meant to rule symbolically while deferring emotionally to a woman who already knows where all the metaphorical bodies are buried. And yes, sometimes literal ones too. Palaces are nothing if not layered. You notice how the rivalry rarely explodes, it simmers. The mother-in-law controls access, who tutors the children, who advises the king, who handles ceremonial duties. The younger queen may technically outrank her, but socially, emotionally, not even close. You watch the older woman correct her posture, her phrasing, her choices, all with a smile so sweet it could rot teeth. It's mentoring if mentoring came with a side of existential dread. There's a quirky tidbit whispered through letters and court gossip. In some royal households, dowager queens insisted on overseeing their daughters-in-law's wardrobes, not out of fashion interest but control. Clothing signaled status, maturity, fertility, and propriety. A neckline too low or a color too bold could be framed as moral failure. Imagine your mother-in-law choosing your outfits for state dinners while half of Europe judges you. No pressure. You feel the younger queen's isolation keenly. She can't confide in her husband, not really, because that's his mother. She can't complain publicly without looking ungrateful or unstable, so she adapts. She cultivates her own circle, often younger women, foreign advisors, or clergy. The rivalry becomes a cold war fought through appointments and whispers. Historians still argue whether these conflicts were personal or structural, but when you're the one being undermined, the distinction doesn't help you sleep at night. You watch moments where the tension sharpens. Childbirth. The older woman insists on being present, citing tradition. The younger woman knows this means scrutiny, judgment, and the potential rewriting of the narrative if anything goes wrong. A healthy son strengthens the younger queen's position. A daughter, or worse, complications, can be framed as weakness. The stakes are intimate and brutal. And no, this is not the kind of family bonding moment you put in a scrapbook. There's a subtle humour in how predictable it all is. The older woman once endured the same treatment and swore she'd be kinder. Then power happened. Funny how that works. It's like saying you'll never be weird about email signatures and then suddenly you're debating whether best sounds too cold. Multiply that by absolute monarchy. You also notice how these rivalries shaped succession politics. A mother-in-law might push for regency rights, citing the youth or fragility of the reigning queen. She might question her daughter-in-law's loyalty, fertility, or sanity. The younger queen, in response, might accelerate alliances, rush heirs, or subtly edge her elder out of ceremonial roles. Historians still argue whether these maneuvers were defensive or aggressive, but the outcome was the same. A court split into factions labelled by age and bloodline. One fringe account suggests that some dowager queens deliberately exaggerated their infirmities to maintain sympathy and relevance, only to recover miraculously when influence was threatened. Whether that's true or just early modern shade is up for debate, but you can't help admiring the commitment. Weaponized frailty is still a thing, just saying. As you move through this rivalry, you feel how deeply gender expectations cut. Men aged into authority, women aged out of it unless they found ways to cling. The older woman fears erasure. The younger woman fears suffocation. They are locked together by tradition, neither able to fully win without the other losing. It's a zero-sum game played with lace gloves and sharpened smiles. You file this away too because the pattern is expanding. Power between royal women is rarely transferred cleanly. It's hoarded, contested, resented, and every generation tells itself it will be different. It never is. You leave the room quietly, the echo of silk skirts and unspoken accusations trailing behind you. Ahead, the rivalries grow louder, riskier, more public. But this one, the mother-in-law watching from the shadows, never really leaves. She just learns new ways to haunt the throne. You don't stop moving. You just drift forward, because in royal life, one rivalry bleeds into the next without so much as a deep breath. The walls change, more gilded now, more official, and you realize you've stepped into one of the most quietly explosive dynamics of all, consorts against crowned queens. This is where titles lie, etiquette pretends to matter, and everyone knows exactly who holds the real authority, even if no one is allowed to say it out loud. You see the reigning queen first. She is not someone's wife. She is the crown. A mainstream historical fact grounds you here. Ruling queens were legally sovereign in their own right, yet were often pressured to marry to stabilize alliances. The contradiction is immediate and uncomfortable. You can feel it in the way courtiers hesitate. Should they bow to the queen or flatter the man beside her? And standing just off to the side, you notice the consort wearing power like an ill-fitting garment, smiling too hard. The consort's role is undefined by design. Sometimes he's expected to disappear. Sometimes he's expected to rule quietly through her. Sometimes he expects far more than anyone intends to give. Historians still argue whether royal consorts pose the greatest internal threat to ruling queens, but watching the tension coil between them, it's hard not to see why. You imagine conversations where every word is weighed, every decision double-checked, because intimacy doesn't erase hierarchy, it sharpens it. You feel how quickly resentment can grow. The queen is sovereign, but the consort is often male in patriarchal systems that aren't quite sure what to do with that reversal. He may have political training, noble blood, foreign backing. He may also have expectations that clash violently with reality. You watch him interrupt councils, advise policies, or cultivate his own faction under the guise of support. It's teamwork, allegedly. It rarely feels like it. There's a quirky tidbit that floats in from court gossip and marginal notes. Some consorts were deliberately excluded from coronation rituals to reinforce their subordinate status. Others insisted on being crowned alongside their wives, triggering outrage and fear. You can almost hear the murmurs. What does it mean if he wears a crown? What happens if people start listening to him instead? It's the medieval version of arguing over whose name goes first on the mortgage. You notice how the queen's authority is constantly tested. If she resists her consort's influence, she risks being labelled cold, unfeminine, or unstable. If she yields too much, she's accused of being controlled. Historians still argue whether queens could ever win this balancing act, or whether the structure itself was designed to make them fail. Either way, you watch her navigate it with exhaustion tucked behind ceremonial calm. Sometimes the rivalry is reversed. The consort may feel trapped, mocked, diminished. He might resent being expected to defer publicly while privately shouldering blame for decisions he didn't make. In fringe accounts, you find hints of consorts sabotaging their wives' authority through passive resistance, missing meetings, leaking doubts, aligning with opposition nobles. Nothing dramatic, just enough friction to make governance feel impossible. Think of it as weaponized incompetence, but with crowns. You sense how the court feeds on this tension. Advisors choose sides, foreign ambassadors test boundaries. Every disagreement between queen and consort becomes an opportunity. A joke lands wrong, a chair is placed slightly behind, a proclamation uses we instead of I, and suddenly everyone is reading into it. You're not imagining it. This is how power leaks. There's also the question of heirs. The consort's legacy is biological as much as political. The queen's body becomes a battleground where authority and expectation collide. You watch pregnancy announcements shift the balance, temporarily empowering the queen while tying her more tightly to the consort. Historians still argue whether motherhood strengthened or weakened ruling queens, and you can see why. It did both, often at once. You catch yourself almost sympathizing with both sides, which feels uncomfortable and very human. The queen didn't ask for her sovereignty to be conditional. The consort didn't ask to be ornamental, but the system thrives on their tension, and like any good system, it pretends it's about tradition while quietly rewarding whoever adapts fastest. Let's lighten this with a small, sleepy joke. Imagine being told you're married to power, but you're not allowed to touch the thermostat. That's the vibe. As you move on, you recognize the pattern deepening. Rivalry doesn't require hatred, it just requires overlapping roles and insufficient clarity. In royal life, that's basically the job description. You glance back at the throne room where two figures stand side by side, united in appearance, divided in reality. And you know this won't be the last time intimacy and authority collide in ways that leave no one comfortable. You step forward again, carrying the echo of that imbalance with you, because ahead the rivals won't be married. They'll be competing for love, loyalty, and legitimacy in far less formal ways. You don't get a pause. You just drift from sanctioned power into something far more volatile, because now the rivalry isn't written into law. It's written into bedrooms, letters, and late-night corridors where servants learn to walk silently. You've entered the world of queens versus mistresses, and the temperature shifts immediately. This is not polite competition. This is personal. You see the queen first because she is always visible. Her role is public, ceremonial, endlessly scrutinized. A mainstream historical fact settles in. In many royal courts, mistresses were unofficial yet deeply influential figures, often granted estates, titles, and access that rivaled legitimate authority. You can feel the humiliation baked into that arrangement. The queen is crowned, anointed, prayed over. The mistress is chosen, and somehow that feels worse. You watch how the rivalry unfolds in layers. The queen has legitimacy, lineage, and expectation. The mistress has intimacy, novelty, and emotional leverage. Historians still argue whether mistresses held more real power than queens in certain courts, but standing here, you sense how power shifts with proximity. A whispered suggestion at the right moment can outweigh a signed decree, especially when it comes with affection. There's a quirky, almost unbelievable tidbit that floats through court records. Some mistresses were assigned official apartments within palace complexes, sometimes closer to the king's chambers than the queen's own rooms. Imagine navigating that hallway night after night, knowing exactly who is closer to the center of gravity. That's not architecture, it's a message. You feel the queen's restraint tightening. She can't lash out without consequences. Open jealousy risks moral judgment, political backlash, or accusations of hysteria, so she adapts. She becomes colder, sharper, more controlled, or she collapses inward, letting the mistress occupy emotional territory while she maintains formal authority. Neither option feels like winning. Historians still argue whether queens were expected to tolerate mistresses as a political necessity or whether that expectation was a deliberate form of control. The mistress, meanwhile, exists in a precarious spotlight. She is powerful but conditional. Her influence depends on favor, and favor is fickle. You watch her perform loyalty, charm, discretion, sometimes even deference to the queen in public, which is its own kind of cruelty. A smile exchanged in a corridor can carry more venom than an argument. And yes, sometimes they genuinely disliked each other. Sometimes they feared each other more. There are fringe accounts, memoirs written long after the fact, that suggest queens occasionally cultivated cordial relationships with mistresses, not out of kindness but strategy. Information flowed through these women. Influence could be shared, redirected, neutralized. Historians still argue whether these alliances were real or retroactively romanticized, but the idea lingers. Survival through proximity. not confrontation. You notice how children complicate everything. A mistress's son could threaten succession, or at least stir anxiety. The Queen's children, legitimate and titled, still had to compete for attention and affection. You can almost feel the air crackle when a king favors one child over another, regardless of status. That's not just family drama, it's a political earthquake. And the women? They're blamed for all of it. Here's your light joke before this gets too tense. Imagine having to host state dinners with someone who literally replaced you in the emotional hierarchy, and you're expected to be gracious. That's not diplomacy, that's endurance training. You sense how the court thrives on this rivalry. Advisors leak, servants observe, ambassadors speculate. The queen and mistress become symbols, virtue versus desire, stability versus passion. Neither label is fair. Both are limiting. Historians still argue whether these narratives were constructed to absolve kings of responsibility, and honestly, that argument feels very modern. As you move through this space, you realize how deeply gendered the blame is. The king's choices are framed as inevitability. The women's responses are framed as character flaws. Rivalry becomes the story because it's easier than admitting imbalance. And once again, royal women are set against each other in a game they didn't design. You leave the chamber quietly, the echo of laughter and whispered endearments fading behind you. The rivalry doesn't end when favor shifts, it just changes shape. And ahead you sense something colder waiting. These next rivals won't be chosen by love, but by borders. You move forward without ceremony because the palace doesn't care about your emotional recovery time. The air changes again, sharper now, like salt carried in on foreign wind. You've stepped into a rivalry shaped not by affection or blood, but by geography. These are foreign brides versus native royal women, and the tension hits before anyone even speaks. You see her arrive, new queen, unfamiliar accent, unfamiliar customs, unfamiliar gods sometimes. A mainstream historical fact anchors you here. Royal marriages were diplomatic tools, often uniting rival nations through young women sent far from home. You feel the weight of that displacement immediately. She's crowned, yes, but she's also isolated. And waiting for her is a court full of women who already know how things work and have no intention of making it easy. The native royal women move first. Sisters, aunts, cousins, long-entrenched ladies in waiting. They control the social oxygen. They decide which traditions matter, which mistakes are unforgivable, which silences mean rejection. You watch them correct the foreign queen's pronunciation, her dress, her gestures, always framed as help. Historians still argue whether xenophobia or political self-preservation drove these behaviors, but standing here, the hostility feels personal either way. There's a quirky tidbit buried in etiquette manuals and marginal notes. Foreign queens were sometimes deliberately given incorrect instructions about court customs, only to be publicly corrected later. A harmless prank or a calculated humiliation? Historians still argue, but the effect was the same. Authority chipped away, one embarrassed moment at a time. You can almost hear the murmurs ripple through the hall when she missteps, soft, satisfied. You feel how the rivalry tightens around language. The foreign queen speaks carefully, aware that every mistake becomes a story. The native women speak freely, sharing jokes and references she can't access. Laughter becomes exclusion. Silence becomes judgment. And the queen learns quickly that power without fluency is fragile, very fragile. You notice how religion deepens the divide. A foreign bride might bring different rituals, saints, or confessions. The native women, rooted in local faith, watch her closely. Too devout, and she's strange. Not devout enough, and she's dangerous. Historians still argue whether religious suspicion was genuinely about belief or merely a socially acceptable weapon, but the result is constant surveillance. Even prayer becomes political. Let's pause for a gentle, sleepy joke. Imagine moving to a new country where your in-laws not only critique your cooking, but believe your cooking could destabilize the state. That's the vibe. You also sense how beauty and fashion become battlegrounds. The foreign queen style is exotic until it's inappropriate. Native women may imitate her when it's advantageous, then condemn her for the same choices. It's a no-win loop. You watch trends ripple outward, then snap back with moral judgment attached. Historians still argue whether queens truly influenced fashion or whether courts merely blamed them for change they already feared. There's a darker edge here too. Native women often framed themselves as protectors of tradition, positioning the foreign queen as a threat to stability. They whispered about her advisors, her letters home, her loyalties, and because she was foreign, suspicion stuck. You feel how exhausting it is to prove allegiance in a place that benefits from doubting you. As you move through this rivalry, you recognize its longevity. This isn't about individual personalities. It's structural. Foreignness never fully fades. Even decades later, even after children and sacrifices, the queen can still be not from here. Historians still argue whether any foreign queen truly overcame this barrier or whether acceptance was always conditional. The evidence leans toward the latter. You take one last look at the arrival hall, the banners, the forced smiles, the watching eyes. The rivalry is already set before the crown touches her head. And you carry that awareness with you because next, the competition will sharpen around something even more dangerous than origin. It will center on children. You don't need a map to know where this is going. The air tightens the moment children enter the picture, because now the rivalry isn't symbolic or social, it's existential. You step into a space where royal women smile over cradles while quietly calculating futures, and you realize that nothing sharpens competition like the promise of an heir. You feel it immediately, the shift from personal tension to generational warfare. A mainstream historical fact settles in here. Succession crises were among the most destabilizing forces in monarchies, and women were often judged almost entirely on their ability to produce suitable heirs, not healthy children, not loved children, suitable ones, male preferably, and suddenly every pregnancy, every birth, every childhood illness becomes a political event with spectators. You watch two women across the room, maybe sisters-in-law, maybe a queen, and a rival consort, both mothers now, both pretending neutrality. Their sons play together, but the women don't relax. They count. Ages, health, temperament, favor. Who looks stronger? Who resembles the king more? Who's spoken of more warmly by advisors? Historians still argue whether maternal rivalry was consciously encouraged by courts or simply an inevitable outcome, but standing here, it feels almost engineered. There's a quirky tidbit tucked into letters and household accounts. In some courts, children were deliberately educated separately to prevent emotional bonds that might complicate future power struggles. Imagine being told your child can't play with their cousin because one day they might need to oppose him. Bedtime stories, but make them dystopian. You notice how motherhood, often romanticized, becomes surveillance. Wet nurses are chosen strategically. Tutors report back. Even lullabies aren't safe from interpretation. A mother advocating too strongly for her child is labeled ambitious. One who doesn't is labeled negligent. Historians still argue whether royal mothers had any real agency in shaping their children's futures, or whether they were merely conduits for male lineage. Watching them maneuver, you suspect the truth sits uncomfortably in between. You feel the emotional toll. These women are expected to love their children deeply, while preparing them for a world that may destroy them or be destroyed by them. Rivalry creeps in not because they want it, but because they can't afford not to protect their child's claim. And protection, in this environment, looks a lot like quiet aggression. Let's soften the tension with a small joke before it gets too heavy. Imagine playdates where the subtext is, one of these toddlers might depose the other. No juice box can fix that. You also sense how miscarriages and stillbirths intensify rivalry rather than compassion. Loss is private grief, but in royal life, it's also public weakness. One woman's tragedy becomes another's opportunity, even if neither wants it to be. Historians still argue whether courts intentionally pitted grieving mothers against one another, but the timing of alliances and whispers suggests a certain opportunism. There's a darker fringe belief you encounter in pamphlets and rumour. Accusations that rival mothers tampered with food, medicine, or prayers. Most historians dismiss these claims as paranoia, fueled by fear and misogyny, but the fact that people believed them tells you everything. Trust evaporates when inheritance is at stake. Even maternal instinct gets questioned. You realize how deeply unfair the framework is. Men produce heirs, women bear consequences. A child's gender, health, or personality becomes a verdict on a woman's worth. And when two women's children represent rival futures, those judgments turn them into enemies whether they like it or not. Historians still argue whether these rivalries could have been avoided in different systems, but monarchies thrived on scarcity. Only one future could win. As you move on, you carry the echo of children's laughter fading into strategic silence. This rivalry doesn't end when the children grow, it mutates. Because soon, the women closest to power won't be mothers or queens at all. They'll be the ones standing just behind them. You don't notice them at first. That's the point. They're always there, adjusting sleeves, holding keys, passing notes, but never centered, never crowned. And that's exactly why the rivalry among ladies-in-waiting is so dangerous. You step into a quieter kind of battlefield now, where proximity replaces rank and access, becomes everything. A mainstream historical fact settles in as you watch them move. Ladies-in-waiting were often noblewomen placed near queens for companionship, surveillance or influence, sometimes all at once. They weren't servants in the modern sense. They were eyes, ears, and sometimes extensions of rival factions. You feel the tension in how carefully they observe one another, every gesture weighed for meaning. Nothing here is casual. You notice how rivalry forms not over titles, but over intimacy. Who helps the queen dress? Who hears her complain? Who's trusted with private letters or late-night conversations? These moments seem small, but they accumulate power fast. Historians still argue whether ladies-in-waiting wielded disproportionate influence compared to their official rank, but watching them compete for access, you can feel the stakes humming under the silk. There's a quirky tidbit hidden in household records. Some ladies-in-waiting kept detailed personal journals, not for sentiment, but leverage. Names, moods, passing remarks, stored carefully, like emotional currency. You imagine the patience required for that kind of quiet ambition. No crown, no guarantee, just the long game. Honestly, respect, but also, yikes. You feel how rivalry sharpens when loyalty is questioned. One misplaced whisper, one overheard comment, and suddenly trust fractures. A lady-in-waiting might subtly undermine another by misremembering instructions or relaying concerns at just the wrong moment. Historians still argue whether these betrayals were deliberate or the result of paranoia, but in an environment built on suspicion, intention almost doesn't matter. Here's your light joke before things get too tense. Imagine office politics, but your co-workers literally help you bathe and know all your secrets. HR is not equipped for this. You also notice how queens themselves sometimes encouraged this rivalry. Divided attendants were easier to control. If no one fully trusted anyone else, loyalty flowed upward. It's not pretty, but it's effective. Historians still argue whether queens consciously manipulated these dynamics or simply benefited from them, but the pattern repeats too often to ignore. The emotional cost shows in small ways. Friendships form, then strain. Support turns conditional. A woman promoted to favor today might be dismissed tomorrow, replaced without explanation. You feel the instability in how quickly fortunes change, how silence follows someone who's fallen from grace. It's not exile, but it's close enough to hurt. You step back and realize something important. These rivalries don't stay contained. A lady-in-waiting aligned with one queen might later marry into power, carry secrets forward, or influence future generations. The ripple effect is real. Historians still argue how many political shifts can be traced back to these women, but the evidence keeps surfacing in margins and footnotes. As you move on, the palace seems louder again, less intimate. You've seen how rivalry thrives not just at the top, but in the shadows just beneath it. And ahead, those shadows stretch across something far larger than etiquette or access. They stretch across belief itself. You step forward and feel the air cool, not with night, but with doctrine. This rivalry isn't whispered over silk or sealed with glances. It's spoken from pulpits, stitched into prayer books, and justified as righteousness. You've entered the space where royal women clash over faith, and the tension here feels heavier because everyone claims divine backing. A mainstream historical fact anchors you immediately. Religious divisions in Europe and beyond often align directly with royal households, turning queens into symbols of belief as much as individuals. You feel how belief stops being private the moment a crown is involved. What a queen believes can legitimize laws, persecutions, or alliances. And when two royal women believe differently or are perceived to, it's no longer disagreement, it's threat. You watch one queen kneel with deliberate devotion, her gestures measured, her piety visible. Across the room, another royal woman observes, interpreting every ritual as performance or provocation. Historians still argue whether religious rivalries among royal women were genuinely theological or primarily political, but standing here, you sense how belief becomes a language of power, whether it starts sincerely or not. There's a quirky tidbit preserved in court correspondence. Queens were sometimes advised to adjust the visibility of their faith rather than its substance. Attend fewer services, choose different saints, pray less publicly, not because belief was wrong, but because it was politically inconvenient. You imagine the exhaustion of managing your conscience like a public relations campaign. You notice how rivalry intensifies when religion intersects with motherhood. A child baptized into one faith represents a future aligned with it. Suddenly, choices about tutors, clergy, even lullabies become battlegrounds. Historians still argue whether queens had meaningful control over their children's religious upbringing, but records show fierce behind-the-scenes struggles that never made official decrees. Let's ease the weight with a light joke before it presses too hard. Imagine being told your personal spirituality is a bit controversial, like choosing pineapple on pizza, but with heresy charges. You feel how these rivalries rarely stay contained within palace walls. Nobles choose sides, foreign powers intervene, a queen's chapel becomes a gathering point for supporters, and others become suspect. Women are blamed for unrest they didn't create, accused of poisoning faith itself. Historians still argue whether queens were scapegoated for conflicts driven by men, but the pattern is painfully consistent. There's a fringe belief whispered in pamphlets and sermons that certain queens brought divine punishment upon realms simply by existing in the wrong faith. Famine? Her fault. Plague? Also her fault. Bad harvest? Definitely her. You feel the cruelty of that logic settle in your chest. Belief becomes a weapon not just against rivals, but against reason. You also sense how faith could be used defensively. A queen under threat might lean harder into devotion, cultivating an image of holiness that made attacking her politically dangerous. Her rival, in response, might frame that devotion as hypocrisy or fanaticism. Historians still argue whether these strategies were cynical or sincere, but in royal life, sincerity and strategy often overlapped uncomfortably. As you move on, the prayers fade, but the rivalry lingers. Faith doesn't disappear when the candles go out. It reshapes identity, loyalty, and memory. And the next rivalry waiting for you won't be fought with doctrine or blood. It will be fought with mirrors. You step into a brighter space now, almost deceptively so. Light floods in through tall windows, bouncing off polished floors and carefully arranged mirrors. This rivalry is easier to spot because it's visible, measured in glances, reflected in glass. You're standing in the arena of beauty, youth, and court favour, where royal women learn early that appearance is not vanity. It's currency. A mainstream historical fact settles in with uncomfortable clarity. In many royal courts, a woman's perceived beauty and youth directly affected her political influence, especially when male rulers equated attractiveness with virtue or vitality. You feel the pressure immediately. Aging isn't just personal here, it's political. And every younger woman entering the court shifts the balance like a sudden draft. You watch an older queen move with practiced elegance, her face composed, her gestures restrained. Across the room, a younger royal woman, maybe a new bride, maybe a rising favourite, laughs more freely, catches more eyes. The rivalry isn't spoken aloud, but it's there, humming under the music. Historians still argue whether courts consciously prioritized youth or simply reflected broader societal obsessions, but the outcome is painfully clear either way. There's a quirky tidbit tucked into cosmetic recipes and beauty manuals of the era. Royal women used everything from crushed pearls to alarming substances in their skincare, chasing brightness and smoothness. You remember that earlier mention of crocodile dung sunscreen? Yes, that was a real thing, and yes, people believed in it. Beauty rituals weren't indulgence, they were survival strategies wrapped in alchemy. You feel how fashion sharpens rivalry. A daring sleeve, a daring neckline, a daring colour. Each choice is read as confidence or desperation depending on who wears it. The same dress on two different women tells two different stories. Historians still argue whether queens truly set trends or whether they were punished for them, but the double standard is undeniable. Let's slip in a soft joke before the mirrors multiply too much. Imagine aging in a workplace where your performance review includes your cheekbones. That's court life. There is no anti-aging filter strong enough for that. You also sense how court favour amplifies these tensions. Attention from the ruler, from ambassadors, from chroniclers, it all gravitates toward what feels new. The older woman becomes dignified, the younger becomes radiant. Neither label is neutral. One signals fading relevance, the other scrutiny and expectation. Historians still argue whether beauty was a blessing or a trap, but watching the cycle repeat, you realize it's almost always both. There's a darker undercurrent too. Aging queens weren't just sidelined, they were sometimes mocked, accused of witchcraft, or framed as unnatural for resisting invisibility. Youthful women, meanwhile, were accused of manipulation simply for existing in appealing bodies. Rivalry thrives because both sides are punished differently, but equally. You notice how women internalized this competition. Mirrors became tools of self-surveillance. Compliments became threats. A new grey hair wasn't just personal, it was geopolitical. Historians still argue whether women were conscious participants in this system or its most visible casualties. But standing here, the distinction blurs. As you move past the mirrors, you feel the rivalry soften into something quieter, but more enduring. Beauty fades, youth shifts, but comparison doesn't stop, because even when these women never meet, never speak, never share a room, they can still compete across borders. You don't need to cross a threshold to feel the distance now. The rivalry stretches outward, beyond walls and corridors, across borders and seas. You're standing in a strange, quiet space where royal women never meet, never speak directly, yet remain deeply entangled. These are queens competing across nations, watching each other through reports, portraits, and rumor. A mainstream historical fact anchors you here. Early modern diplomacy relied heavily on personal reputation, and queens were often compared explicitly by foreign courts to assess strength, stability, and legitimacy. You feel how comparison becomes currency. One queen's success sharpens another's insecurity, even hundreds of miles away. Influence is no longer local. It's international branding centuries before the word existed. You imagine messengers arriving with letters describing another queen's coronation, her marriage, her children, her reforms. Each detail is weighed. Is she loved, feared, fertile, pious? Historians still argue whether queens consciously modeled themselves against foreign rivals or whether courts projected that rivalry onto them, but the effect is the same. Identity becomes reactive. There's a quirky tidbit tucked into ambassadorial reports. Portraits of queens were sometimes altered slightly to flatter or diminish, depending on political intent. A smoother complexion here, a harsher angle there. You realize these images weren't art, they were strategy. Imagine being judged by a painting you never approved, hanging in a palace you'll never see. You feel how rivalry intensifies during crises. If one queen suppresses a rebellion, others are judged by comparison. If one navigates religious unrest successfully, another's failures feel louder. Historians still argue whether these comparisons were fair or deeply gendered, but the tone of correspondence suggests a special scrutiny reserved for women in power. Success was impressive, failure was personal. Let's soften this with a quiet joke. Imagine your career being compared to someone else's on the other side of the continent, based on a single LinkedIn profile photo. That's cross-border queenship. You also sense how alliances between these women were possible, but fragile. Letters exchanged in warm tones could shift suddenly if interests diverged. Compliments carried subtext, praise masked evaluation. Historians still argue whether these correspondences were genuine attempts at solidarity or polite surveillance, but you can feel the tension humming between the lines. There's a deeper loneliness here. These queens share an experience no one else understands, yet rivalry prevents real connection. They are mirrors without reflection, shadows chasing each other across maps. One queen's fall becomes another's cautionary tale. One queen's triumph becomes another's burden. You notice how historians later turned these women into binaries, strong versus weak, wise versus reckless, flattening complexity into comparison. Rivalry outlived them, preserved in textbooks and popular memory. Historians still argue whether this framing distorts reality, but it persists because it's easy. And easy stories stick. As you move on, the borders fade back into walls, the maps into corridors. You carry with you the sense that rivalry doesn't require proximity. It just requires visibility. And next you'll see what happens when royal women try to escape rivalry by forming alliances of their own. Spoiler, it's complicated. You move forward expecting relief, because surely alliance must feel softer than rivalry. Surely cooperation between royal women would offer rest, but almost immediately you feel how fragile that hope is. These are political alliances between women, carefully constructed, delicately balanced, and always one wrong word away from collapse. A mainstream historical fact settles in quietly. Royal women often formed alliances to counter male-dominated councils, protect heirs, or stabilize their own positions. You can feel the intention behind these bonds. Shared vulnerability, it's opportunity. Two queens or a queen and a powerful noblewoman find strength in mutual recognition. Finally, someone who understands the rules and the cost of breaking them. You watch these alliances form over letters, shared causes, coordinated appearances. A smile held a fraction too long, a seat arranged deliberately beside another woman. Historians still argue whether such alliances were strategic inventions or genuine emotional bonds, but the truth seems layered. You can care about someone and still need them politically. Royal life rarely lets you separate the two. There's a quirky tidbit tucked into correspondence. Women often used familial language, sister, cousin, dear heart, even when no blood relation existed. It softened negotiation, created intimacy, and implied loyalty. You sense how powerful that language was. To be called sister in a palace was to be momentarily safe. Momentarily. You feel how quickly tension creeps in. Alliances require balance, and balance is unstable. Who benefits more? Who is seen as the leader? Who speaks first, or is quoted most often? Historians still argue whether alliances between royal women failed because of personal betrayal or because external pressures made them unsustainable. Watching one alliance fracture over succession disputes or shifting loyalties, you suspect the latter did most of the damage. Let's slip in a light joke before the trust issues spiral. Imagine forming a group chat where everyone is supportive, brilliant, and one bad screenshot away from ruining your life. That's the energy. You notice how men around these women often viewed their alliances with suspicion. Cooperation was framed as conspiracy. Solidarity was framed as manipulation. Advisors whispered warnings, framing one woman as dominant and the other as naive. Historians still argue whether male anxiety about female alliances shaped their downfall, but the reaction was consistent. Divide them before they become dangerous. You also sense how alliances could become cages. A woman tied too closely to another's fate risks falling when the other stumbles. Loyalty becomes liability. Breaking away looks like betrayal. Staying looks like weakness. Historians still argue whether any royal woman successfully maintained a long-term alliance without sacrificing autonomy, and the silence that follows that question feels telling. You watch one alliance dissolve not in anger, but in distance. Letters slow, visits stop, praise turns vague. It's not dramatic, but it's devastating. The court notices, the protection evaporates, rivalry seeps back in, filling the space where trust briefly lived. As you move on, you understand something important. Alliances didn't end rivalry, they postponed it, they reshaped it. And the next rivalry waiting for you doesn't rely on proximity, beauty, or belief. It relies on whispers. You slow your steps without meaning to, because this rivalry doesn't rush. It seeps. It waits. You're in the realm of scandal, rumor, and reputation now, where no confrontation is required and no proof is necessary. This is where royal women learned that the most effective weapon didn't need to be sharp, it just needed to be believable. A mainstream historical fact settles uneasily into place. Courts thrived on gossip as an informal system of communication, often more influential than official proclamations. You feel how reputation becomes a second body you carry, one you can't control once it starts moving on its own. A glance, a delay, a closed door. Anything can become a story. And stories, once told, do not return quietly. You watch one woman's name change shape as it passes through mouths. She was reserved, now she's cold. She was friendly, now she's inappropriate. Another woman's piety becomes performative. Another's grief becomes instability. Historians still argue whether rumor was deliberately orchestrated by rivals or whether courts naturally produced it. But standing here, you see how easily it could be guided with just a nudge. There's a quirky tidbit buried in marginal notes and trial records. Some queens employed trusted confidants, specifically to track rumors about them, like an early warning system for reputational damage. You imagine the exhaustion of managing not just your actions, but everyone else's interpretation of them. It's PR before public relations existed, and it's relentless. You feel how rivalry thrives in ambiguity. Accusations don't need to be explicit. A raised eyebrow can suggest impropriety. A sudden concern for morality can imply guilt without saying a word. Historians still argue whether women were targeted more heavily by scandal than men, but the survival rates tell a clear story. Men recovered. Women were remembered by the rumor. Let's soften the chill with a small joke. Imagine your entire legacy being decided by a group chat you were never invited to. That's court gossip. You also notice how scandal was often framed as concern. I'm worried about her influence. I hope she's well. These phrases carried poison wrapped in politeness. Rival women didn't need to invent crimes, they just needed to repeat uncertainty. And once doubt existed, it did the work for them. There's a darker edge here. Some rumors stuck because they aligned with existing fears: the foreign queen, the ambitious mother, the aging woman refusing to fade. Historians still argue whether scandal reflected truth or prejudice, but you feel how easily the two merged when power was involved. Reputation wasn't about who you were, it was about what people needed you to represent. You realize how devastating this was emotionally. A woman could follow every rule and still be undone by suggestion alone. Defending yourself only fueled suspicion. Silence looked like guilt. It's a trap with no dignified exit. Rivalry here doesn't scream, it whispers until everyone hears it. As you move forward, the whispers fade into echoes. Some women survived scandal, others didn't. And ahead, you sense the coldest rivalry yet, the kind that doesn't end in embarrassment or exile. It ends behind locked doors. You feel the temperature drop as you step forward, like stone that hasn't seen sunlight in years. This rivalry doesn't need elegance or ambiguity anymore. It ends with keys turning, doors closing, and silence becoming permanent. You are standing in the shadow of imprisoned queens and the women who, directly or indirectly, helped put them there. A mainstream historical fact settles heavily here. Royal women were imprisoned far more often than popular history admits, usually without formal trials, under charges vague enough to justify anything. You feel how gender shaped this punishment. Men were exiled or executed. Women were contained, locked away, made quiet. And often the hands that pushed them toward confinement belonged to other women navigating their own survival. You watch a queen being escorted down a corridor she once ruled, her skirts gathered, her crown already gone. Somewhere nearby, another royal woman watches, not necessarily with triumph, but with calculation. Historians still argue whether female betrayal played a decisive role in these imprisonments, or whether women were merely convenient intermediaries for male authority. Standing here, the answer feels uncomfortably mixed. There's a quirky, unsettling tidbit preserved in household accounts. Some imprisoned queens continued to receive clothing and personal items selected by rival women at court. Control didn't end at the cell door. It followed them inside. You imagine wearing dresses chosen by someone who benefited from your absence. That's not mercy, that's dominance disguised as civility. You feel how betrayal rarely looked like violence. It looked like testimony, silence, agreement, a letter confirming concerns already circulating, a woman vouching for another's instability or dangerous influence. Historians still argue whether these accusations were sincere beliefs or strategic sacrifices, but you sense how fear compresses morality. Survival narrows options. Let's pause with a gentle, uneasy joke before the walls close in completely. Imagine being written out of your own life by a meeting you weren't invited to. That's the prison sentence. You notice how imprisonment often followed long rivalries rather than sudden conflicts. Years of tension, whispers, and positioning led here. When the moment came, the decision felt inevitable, almost merciful compared to execution. That's the lie that made it possible. Historians still argue whether confinement was intended as protection or punishment, but the conditions tell their own story. You also see how women justified their roles afterward. Letters framed decisions as duty, necessity, obedience. Very few admitted ambition. Fewer still admitted relief. Yet relief was there. Relief that the threat was gone, that comparison had ended, that survival no longer required constant vigilance. Rivalry doesn't always end with celebration. Sometimes it ends with exhale. You linger near the cell, listening to the quiet. This is where rivalry becomes irreversible. There are no apologies here, no rebalancing of power, just absence. And the women who remain must live with the knowledge that the system they navigated can turn on them just as easily. You step away slowly because the story isn't finished. Imprisonment removes a woman from power, but it doesn't erase her. And the next rivalry you'll face won't be fought in life at all. It will be fought over memory. You step forward and feel something strange, lighter than stone, heavier than rumor. This rivalry doesn't breathe anymore. It exists in ink, stone, and selective memory. You're standing in the aftermath now, where surviving royal women compete not for power, but for legacy. And this fight somehow lasts the longest. A mainstream historical fact settles quietly into place. History was often written by those closest to power, and royal women who outlived their rivals frequently shaped how events and people were remembered. You feel the advantage immediately. Survival equals authorship. If you remain standing, you get to explain what happened, or at least suggest it strongly enough that no one contradicts you. You watch one woman commission portraits, herself, calm, dignified, maternal. Somewhere else, another woman's image is allowed to fade, reproduced less often, spoken of with vagueness. Historians still argue whether these portrayals reflect truth or deliberate revision, but the patterns are hard to ignore. Memory is curated, absence is editorial. There's a quirky tidbit tucked into royal account books. Funding for tombs, chapels, and memorial masses often increased after a rival's death. On the surface, it looked generous. Beneath it, it was narrative control. You decide how someone is mourned, and therefore how they are understood. Even grief becomes political choreography. You feel how language shifts. A rival was once dangerous. Now she's tragic. Or worse, she's misguided. Historians still argue whether softening language was compassion or erasure, but either way, it stripped complexity away. You realize that rivalry doesn't need to smear if it can simplify. Flattening a life is often more effective than attacking it. Let's ease the weight with a soft joke before the ghosts crowd in. Imagine your enemy writing your obituary. That's the long game of monarchy. You notice how daughters, nieces, and protégés become extensions of this rivalry. Teaching the next generation what to remember and what not to mention is a quiet inheritance. A story left untold becomes truth by default. Historians still argue how many historical mysteries exist simply because someone benefited from forgetting and standing here that feels less mysterious and more intentional. You also sense the emotional cost. Shaping memory means revisiting conflict endlessly, justifying choices, reframing guilt. Survival doesn't bring peace, it brings responsibility for the story, and the story must make you look inevitable, reasonable, right? Rivalry continues, but now it wears the mask of reflection. As you move on, monuments rise around you, statues, tombs, inscriptions, each one a sentence in an argument no one admits is still happening. Some women are remembered as saints, others as warnings, very few as fully human. You carry that awareness with you as the echoes thin, because only one rivalry remains now. Not between women who lived together, competed, or survived each other, but between memory and myth itself. You move into the last space quietly, because this rivalry doesn't echo the way the others did. There are no voices here, no footsteps, no rustle of silk. What remains is resonance, the kind that lingers long after everyone involved is gone. You're standing where royal women continue to compete after death, not through actions, but through symbols, myths, and the stories people choose to keep alive. A mainstream historical fact settles gently into place. Monuments, burial sites, and posthumous honors were carefully negotiated political acts, often reflecting unresolved rivalries rather than reconciliation. You feel it in the way one tomb is placed closer to the altar, another slightly off to the side. Proximity still matters, even now, even here. You imagine two women who never reconciled in life, now remembered side by side in textbooks or documentaries, forever compared. One is praised for strength, the other for softness. One becomes a warning, the other a model. Historians still argue whether these binaries reflect reality or narrative convenience, but you can sense how rivalry survives by being simplified. Complexity doesn't trend well across centuries. There's a quirky, almost haunting tidbit tucked into burial records. In some cases, rival queens were deliberately buried far apart or conspicuously close, depending on who controlled arrangements. Geography becomes commentary. You don't need an inscription to understand the message. Stone placement speaks loudly to those who know how to listen. You feel how myth takes over where documentation thins. Rumors harden into truth. Motivations are assigned retroactively. One woman becomes eternally jealous, another eternally virtuous. Historians still argue whether myth-making says more about the women themselves or the societies retelling their stories, and standing here, you realize rivalry didn't just shape their lives. It shaped how later generations understood womanhood and power. Let's offer one last light joke before the silence deepens. Imagine being compared to someone you argued with centuries ago by people who've never read the footnotes. Eternal beef, no comment section. You also sense something softer emerging. Distance dulls cruelty. Time allows sympathy. Some rivalries fade into shared tragedy, their edges rounded by empathy. Others remain sharp, preserved because they serve a narrative purpose. Rivalry, you realize, is remembered when it's useful and forgotten when it's inconvenient. And now, finally, the pace slows. The corridors stretch and soften. The sharp angles blur. You no longer feel watched. These women, queens, sisters, mothers, rivals, are no longer fighting. They are resting inside stories that keep changing shape like embers under ash. You don't have to judge them. You don't have to choose sides. You can simply let their lives pass through you, heavy and human and done. The candles dim. The palace exhales. You're safe now. The rivalry stays behind you, folded gently into history, where it can't reach you anymore. Your breathing steadies. The world outside this story grows quieter. And as your thoughts slow and your body settles, remember, power fades, gossip dies, and even rivalry eventually learns how to sleep.